Hi there, I'm Linda Jones. I'm an audiobook narrator. I am coming to you through Voices of Calm, spearheaded by Adam Barr, as a place where we can come together, breathe, and listen to stories. I will be reading to you from Kissing the Witch. It's a remarkable book by Emma Donoghue. This is The Tale of the Bird. When I was as young as you are now, I learned how to save my own life. You think I have saved you, but the truth is that your need has conjured me here. It was a bird that helped me when I was young, but it could have been anything, a stick, a stone, whatever happened by. The thing is to take your own life in your hands. As a child, I weighed mine and did not think it worth saving. Scrubbing the great steps one day, I found an old bent copper knife. In its corroded curve, my reflection was barely a thumbnail high. Now I knew for sure that I was the least thing in the world. The dogs and cats mattered more than I did. They had their places on the earth. They merited their grooming, their feeding, or their drowning. No one questioned their existence. Whereas I was not a necessary animal. There was a man I had been taught to call father. He saw to the horses in the great stables, their bright mouths and metal chorus. His eyes never fell to my level. There was a woman who called herself my mother. She wore an apron like a snow cloud. Her hands blushed red as if ashamed. I could not imagine that I had emerged from her substantial flesh. It seemed more likely that she had found me caught in a cowpat, or behind the apple barrel, or while cleaning out a mousetrap. Once, eavesdropping in the laundry, I heard her tell a neighbor that she had spent 20 years pining for a child. I could hardly have been what she had in mind. You must understand, I was not ill-treated. No one wasted breath flinging insults at my head. I did not belong, that was all. Nor did anything belong to me. Mine was a borrowed life. Considering myself as the louse in their bed, the cuckoo in their nest, I felt a certain reluctant gratitude for the food and shelter they allowed me. I wore scraps of everyone's worn-out clothing. My shoes were made of the gardener's gloves, my shift from old handkerchiefs. My names were hand-me-downs too: girl, the creature, or, most often, you there. Every story I ever heard of changelings, babies swapped at birth or abandoned in bulrushes, I repeated to myself at night to glean their secret message. But I had no idea how I had drifted into the path of these indifferent giants called father and mother, and I did not dare to ask. Only in the fields did I find a sense of proportion. I knew we were all equally minute under the liquid eye of the sky, and equally precious in its sight. I used to sit so still that even the rabbits would not notice me. Seagulls wheeled overhead, gulping out their hunger. Swallows made letters against the sky too brief to read. Once I spent a whole day there, a blade of grass in each hand, to anchor me to the warm earth. I watched the sun rise, pass over my head, and set. Ladybirds mated on my knuckle. A shrew nibbled a hole in my stocking while I tried not to laugh. Such a day was worth any punishment. My mother and father beat me when they felt the need, but only by the rule of thumb. Thin sticks break no bones. What they wanted, I believe, was not to hurt me, but to teach me the way things were. The lesson was simple, and if I did not learn it, I had only myself to blame. The birch pen wrote it often enough on the skin of my back. Keep your horizons narrow, your expectations low, and you will never be unduly disappointed. Keep your heart infinitesimally small, and sorrow will never spy it, never plunge, never flap away with your heart in her claws. So, when one spring, in spite of all this good advice, I fell in love, it felt like disaster. I took a tiny bite and it exploded in my stomach. Love splashed through every cranny, hauled on every muscle, unlocked every joint. I was so full of astonishment I felt 10 feet tall. My shoulders itched as if wings might break through. "Little one, your skin is so soft," said the man as he stroked my cheek with one huge thumb. I always started quivering as soon as I heard his knock at the door. When I opened it and curtsied, my knees dipped like a frog's. His first smile set me a stutter. His eyes, cloudy under billows of black hair, were the only weak thing about him. He could always recognize me by the sound of my breathing. Once I scrubbed the same corner for 3 hours, and when the man finally passed, I upset my pail of dirty suds all down the passage. He stepped back at once, but his shiny leather shoes had been spattered like rocks by the seashore. I tried to wipe them with my apron, but he lifted me to my feet. Such force in his forearm. What an aimed bow was his elbow. How delicious the arc of his shoulder. His hands were backed with a faint black fur. He was like the boulder that parts the river, and he smelt like apples stored in darkness all winter. I, who had nothing and no right to anything, would have him for my very own. And so, somehow, it came to pass. As in the best of stories, as in the dream to which you cling like a torn blanket on an icy morning when it is past time to get up. My father, his words slurred with suspicion, told me that a great man had asked for me. My mother carried in a huge basket of linen and a needle. Unspeaking, we began to cut and sew my new life. I would be a stain on my husband's line, I knew that without her telling. If it was his whim to stoop to lift me up, then I was never to delude myself that I deserved it. I was always to keep in mind the tiny, smoky image of what an insignificant creature I had been before he honored me with his gaze. But when I was presented to him in my new dress, he made me forget all my fears. He discovered my hand in my long sleeve and began to count my fingers. No sooner had my parents backed out of the room than he was bending over me to sink his face into my hair. His whisper boomed. What were they to us now, or we to them? His ear against my cheek gave off a surprising heat. My finger crawled along its furred tunnels like a venturesome bee. He would take me away from all this, he promised, give me a new name, never let anything hurt me. I began to shudder with pleasure. The morning after our wedding, I lay awake beside the hot mountain that was my husband. I traced the brown pattern we had made on the linen. Was it a flower? A claw? A snowflake? At last I decided that it was the sign of 2 leaves growing round each other. I belonged to him now, and he to me. With surprising ease, I learned to rule a house greater than the one I had scrubbed for my keep. I knew who I was at last. This was what I had been born for. I liked to walk through the corridors, my train of brocade sweeping the flagstones. I found delight in every pane of glass I would never have to wash. When, within the month, I found I was with child, every mirror seemed to echo my grandeur. Shameless, I longed for it to show. I wanted to be the shape of an apple or the noontime sun. One morning at midsummer, I woke early and thought I would go out to see the grass grow and the birds rise, as I used to in the days when it was my only consolation. How different I was now. How I had grown rich in things of the spirit and flesh. How my skin felt taut as a tambourine. And then my husband peered sleepily over his shoulder and asked where I was going. It all made perfect sense the way he explained it to me as I sat on the edge of the bed. The danger of wandering under the scathing sun, the risk of exposure to rough men in the cornfields, the unsuitability of such a thing. I nodded and laughed with him, and that morning it was true that I would rather climb into the cave of his arms and fill myself up with bliss again. But as my hips widened, the great house began to seem too small. I paced the corridors until I knew them by heart. I learned every angle of the courtyard. In their smooth leather, my feet itched for the stubble of the open fields, and my eyes strained for a far horizon. I set out again one Sunday when there could be no men in the fields. But still my husband said no. This time his eyes were a little bewildered. I tried again when he was away on business, but the housekeeper would not give me the key to open the gate. I sneaked off another day while he was counting his money, and still he was gentle when they brought me back, though I could see anger stretching itself between his brows. Again, he put it to me in words a child could understand. He enclosed my two hands in one of his huge fists and kissed the tears from my cheeks. I nodded. I wiped my face. I knew it was unreasonable to pine so much for a walk in the sunshine. My husband laughed softly and wondered aloud what a breeding wife would ask for next. To fly a kite? Or a fox for a pet? Or charcoal to chew on? It was only then, staring into the blur of his eyes, that it all became clear to me, and dread stopped up my mouth. Oh, my husband was no tyrant. He would never sell my jewels or steal my children or cut off my head. But now I knew that what I wanted was not the same as what he wanted for me. What this good man had sworn to protect me from was not the same as what I feared. I trusted that he would never let anything hurt me, but he would never let anything touch me either. Summer declined into chilly autumn. From my window I could see restless flocks of birds forming themselves into arrowheads pointing south. Sometimes they faltered, broke from the shape, swung loose like hail, but always they came back together. Day by day my belly swelled with life, but the rest of me was shrinking. My husband had taken to referring to me as if I were someone else. "How is my dearest wife today?" he would ask. And I would stare back mutely and think, I don't know, how is she? Where is she? Who is she? Bring her here so I can ask her how I am to live this life. One day he found me kneeling in a corridor over a bundle of brown feathers. A tiny swallow. It must have flown down a chimney and battered itself to death. I was sobbing so hard he thought my time had come. He was stumbling away in search of the midwife when I turned to him and held out my hands. He peered, his face almost touching the skewed feathers, and for a moment I feared he would laugh. But his face was grave as he raised it towards me. "My love," he said, "what is a bird to us, or we to a bird?" I had no answer to give him. When he tried to lift me up, I was too heavy for him. My legs were frozen to the ground. As I knelt there, aware of his steps dying away, I felt a tremor under my thumbs. When I brought the bird nearer my face, I could sense a tiny pulse, not quite dead then, halfway to alive. In the week that followed, I fed the brittle creature drops of milk from my smallest fingertip and kept it warm in my fur collar. Everything waited. I refused to think about myself, my exceptional fortune, my perfect house, my excellent husband who could make any woman happy if she let him. I simply waited to see if the bird would live. One day it swallowed. One day it stood. One day it flew. And the next it got a glimpse of sky and tried to smash through the glass. I could have kept it beside me, a silk-tethered plaything, but what would have been the use of that? I took it to the highest window in the house and let it out. The kick of its wings was surprisingly strong. The air smelt like frost, but there was still time to reach the summer land. I stood, watching the bird wheel over the rooftops. Flesh weighed me down like a robe. The child within me was kicking, a mute clamor for release. Next time, next year, I would get away somehow, sometime, with or without this child, heading somewhere I knew nothing about but that the sun would shine down on my naked head. I would be hurt, and I would be fearful, but I would never be locked up again. My life was in my own hands now, beating faintly, too small yet for anyone to notice. I cupped freedom to my breast. I would feed it. I would love it. It would grow big enough to carry me away. The bird circled back and hovered outside my window for a moment, as if it had something to say.